Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody who joins us. My name is Khmeleva, and I want to thank you for joining us at Ukraine Media Center Ukraine Forum. It's been 9 years of the war and 1 year, a little bit more than a year of the full-scale invasion. During this year, at such term as the sanctions against Russia entered our everyday lives, we understand that sanctions became a tool of pressure on Russia. And within this year, we were all following how those sanctions are being imposed by our international partners, how they were reinforced, how the pressure was reinforced, and some analysts already bring up the question whether they are an effective instrument for the time being. So today we invited you to discuss this important matter: how efficient are the sanctions after 1 year of the full-scale invasion. And I want to introduce our speakers today. They are Ilona Khmeleva, expert of the Economic Security Council of Ukraine; Yaroslav Yurchyshyn, People's Deputy of Ukraine; Agiya Zagrebelska, Deputy Chief of Staff of the National Agency on Corruption Prevention; Alexandra Vasylenko, Special Envoy on the Sanctions Policy at the Foreign Ministry of Ukraine. Joining us online is Tom Ewing, Associate Fellow at Royal United Services Institute. Good afternoon, Mr. Tom. And Roman Vybranovskyy, Communication Expert and founder of Foreign Media Department at National Security and Defense Council. So good afternoon, dear friends. Let's start this discussion. Ms. Ilona, probably let's start with you. Well, do the sanctions work or not, and to what extent? Thank you for this question. Let's start this discussion with something positive. Yes, the sanctions work, and this is something that all of us and both Ukrainians and our international partners try to prove, all the skeptics. So the conclusion of this year is that Russian economy ended up in quite a complicated condition, but we have to recognize that they are still not ideal, and that will be the main sense of our discussion today. Why the sanctions work? Even if we look at the way the Russian Federation performs its information policies, information wars, psychological operations, to prove that the sanctions are more harmful to Europe or to Ukraine than to Russia, we may see that even in the view of all these efforts, the sanctions work. And another important matter is that the sanction policy united the world. I mean the civilized democratic world. It was united, but even today we see that there are new packages of sanctions are being brought in effect, and no matter how we criticize it, we understand that there are some minuses, but we will discuss the 10th package of sanctions. And the main thing is that they exist and there is solidarity in the European Union. On the other hand, the main challenge existing today is the change of approaches to the sanctions, and I see two main problems there. And they are that not all of the countries support the sanction policy, and talking about the so-called the world beyond the Western world is the main summary of the Munich conference, that there is a lot of countries that do not join the sanctions, and this is what Ukraine works on. And there are also mechanisms to get around the sanctions, and there are many international companies still working in Russian Federation. So those are the two main challenges we will be fighting with today. They are very urgent for Ukraine. Mr. Yaroslav, what's your opinion in this regard? The sanctions are, well, generally we cannot say whether the sanctions work or not. We cannot afford it, but because it's the only mechanism which will increase the cost of military aggression of Russian Federation without using the military force. Is the mechanism of getting around or avoiding a number of victims we have at this moment. But the question is how to make it more efficient. The world is adapted very quickly, and the mechanisms of getting around the sanctions, they appear at the very day at that very day when the sanctions are imposed. And we have to work inside of Ukraine, convincing our international partners that we do our homework. Many countries like Great Britain, United States, they have recommendations of the European bodies for criminalization of avoiding sanctions. So what are sanctions? The sanctions are a safety switch. We have suspicion that this or that person, individual or a company will do some harmful influence, and this is why the sanctions are being imposed in their regard. So if they change the structure of their property, this is the criminalization, and it just raises the level of liability. So upon the initiative of the sanction group of Yermak Makfol, there is initiated and registered in the Ukrainian parliament the draft law for criminalization or avoidance of sanctions in Ukraine, because we need synchronicity with our international partners. We have to prove that we do our homework, really. This is why there is a lot of work. Whether the sanctions work, yes, they do. If Russia has any reserve, and yes, they do have it, the reserve of strength, but there may be some indirect sanctions. The West almost ceased of cooperating with Russia. There are some companies like Ashan, for example, but upon the latest resolution of FATF, which started excluding Russia from all the from everywhere, it will be more difficult to withdraw funds from Russia, and which will mean that the Western companies will withdraw from Russia too. And the Expert Council of Economic Security mentioned that we have big problems with other countries. So the secondary sanctions imposed not on the trade with Russia, but to supply of secondary services to Russia, it's very possible. I appreciate the efforts of the Council for Economic Security, who initiated a number of projects, and specifically the projects for catching up with the companies who supply something to Russia through mediators or other mechanisms, the products of non-military purpose, but at the same time they kill Ukrainian citizens, like chips, for example. The chips which support Russian system GLONASS, which are manufactured by the foreign companies, yes, they are manufactured by China and other countries beyond West, but many companies in the West, they try to close their eyes and they say that we have nothing to do with murders of people. So sanctions work is the only peaceful mechanism for stopping the war. Due to the work of the sanctions, Russian propaganda says that the sanctions don't work. Thanks to the fact that they work, we have to go one step ahead of the civilized world, because they may ask us, well, so guys, what about you? So I appreciate the efforts of the National Agency for Corruption Prevention, who stand for our interests not only in the West, but they also work with the Russian collaborationists in Ukraine to have them get under sanctions. We have a good draft law. We may include people in the draft list or companies to the sanction list in relation, and their properties may get confiscated, and those assets may be forwarded for the needs of the armed forces. And there is one answer: we will never be satisfied with the level of sanctions that exist, but we have to convince all the world, not only Western world, that the sanctions are needed and they need to be reinforced. Miss Alexandra, we understand that the work of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is directed at the imposition and reinforcement of sanctions. So how can you evaluate, how can you assess this year in terms of cooperation with our international partners and their evaluation of this process? Thank you for this question. Really, the year 2022 became maybe the year when we got the closest possible, because we created a lot of formats of cooperation, efficient formats, both official, permanent contacts by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, organization of different side events devoted to sanction policies in the fields, in like meetings of G7, United Nations Security Council. So this matter is being brought up at all times. We have back channel communication channels, and we communicate with the representatives of the countries, the sanction coordinators, who at the level of their local legislation, they work on imposition of the sanction packages, because we need to understand that even when the sanction packages are being adopted, there is a next step, their adaptation at the national level, and it's very important story. We built our contacts in a way that we receive directly from our vis-a-vis the information about what's going on behind the curtain, behind the meetings of European Union, who lobbies what, and it gives us opportunity to react. So all of our ambassadors of the sanction coalition, they have a very strictly built messages how and what we develop, where we have the sanction passports for different countries. We focus mostly on countries like, for example, Hungary, a part of European Union, who frequently use who is frequently used for withholding of sanction packages, and we understand there are countries that are used for making way around sanction, or they reinforce their cooperation with Russian Federation. They don't support the products who harm us directly or used in the military industry, but they give Russia an opportunity to obtain necessary technologies, to obtain necessary income in foreign currency, because it's very difficult for them now to withdraw the currency from there and to fulfill export and import operations. So this is why we try to build different formats. We are in constant coordination, in constant communication with coordinators of sanction coalition. We try to the maximum extent to make a joint message for the third countries who are not members of sanction coalition. For example, now we work on a series of visits of the special representative of EU and special representative of USA on sanction policy to the third countries. We worked with the anti-corruption agency of Ukraine on that matter, and what's most important is the feedback on the quality of materials prepared by Ukraine for our international partners, because our international partners, they take a lot, and we closely follow the examples of making way around sanctions, and the anti-corruption agency helps us a lot in that, and we make a tailor-made message for the third countries. And it's important for the countries of Central Asia who are dependent on Russian Federation, who are used as the platform for avoiding sanctions, and it's quite difficult to reach out to them for Ukraine. And we work on the key messages, key tasks, and communicate with them directly, and this is how we get our result. And voting in the United Nations, you see that it was not related directly to sanctions, but the tendency of perception of Ukraine changed. We also ponder over the formats of the sanctions efficiency, which do not have direct relation, for example, to the sanctions like export control. There was a seminar fulfilled by Japan for the countries who cooperate with Russian Federation as to the reinforcement of export control. Is a tangential instruments. However, they are important to have the sanction regime to make it efficient. It's important for the persons under the sanction list to cross the borders, so we try to synchronize those sanction lists, and it brings its results. For example, Bangladesh, which is not a part of sanction coalition, recently prohibited the entrance of the vessels who carry raw Russian oil to the ports of Bangladesh. However, they are not the part of the sanction coalition, so some countries pick the sanction regime by themselves. They don't join officially, but they are being guided by their recommendations, and some countries try to do it in a softer way. But first, they refuse to perform any joint projects, they close the borders, so it's important at every level of contacts, from the head of department to the deputy minister, and all the way up the chain of command. We build the policy of one voice, and we try to deliver this information, and this is how we communicate to our partners. Ms. Agiya, the avoiding of sanctions is an important way. The skeptics mentioned, do really all the sanctions which were imposed more than half a year ago, do they stop working with time, or are they still efficient? Good afternoon, thank you for invitation. I'm happy that skeptics talk about avoiding sanctions, because the more they talk about it, the more attention we will pay to that, because I think that it's unfair to forget the matter of avoiding sanctions. We concentrate more on the number of sanctions, more and more of them, but to have them work to provide for a lesser way of avoiding sanctions, the skeptics, they help us with that. I don't only think that sanctions work, but we really underestimate their effect, because from one hand we may talk about Russian propaganda, but let's be fair, the sanction infrastructure of the world was built during the interwar time, and today it is still being re-equipped for the military rails. And what military rails are, it's more sanctions in a more rapid way. And for example, it's not 100 sanctions which we worked with the partners of sanction coalition, but it's thousands of them. When in banks, the compliance departments should be consisting not of dozens of people but hundreds of people. Is the reconstruction process, and it's going on, and this is why we have an illusion that there is a lot of ways to avoid sanctions. And what's also important, we thought that Russian economy will be in knockout quite shortly, and first 3 months of that shock that Russia experienced, it confirmed our expectations, but we're facing the reality that sanctions is the instrument of long-term action if they're being used against a large economy as Russia. So we need patience and attention to be paid to enforcement. And talking about the ways around sanctions, really there are such ways, and they are numerous, and it's very normal phenomena. It's no news to us, because we actually deal, let's be honest, with Russian businessmen, with Russian oligarchs, with Russian officials. Who are those people? They are champions in bargaining, in corruption. They know how to corrupt, they know how to find criminal ways around sanctions, and it's our task to follow them, to identify all those gaps and to close them. We cannot build the mechanism without gaps right at once. And how to do it efficiently? First of all, it's important, apart from what was mentioned already, like diplomatic work, like Mr. European Deputy mentioned about the criminal liability, but the sanction potential of Ukraine and the partners in sanction coalition, the potential to work with the big data amounts and to have calibrated summaries, to come up with calibrated conclusions, to identify the spots where we may use limited resources in a more efficient manner. So analytic potential is very important. The exchange of information, specifically intelligence data, sensitive data, and it's one of the challenges that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs may confirm. We have these agreements with international coalitions, they don't the partners don't share intelligence data in a very quick way, but the better we build this mechanism for exchange of sensitive information and intelligence information, the more efficient will be the sanction policy. As to coordination, we see G7 improve the coordination. They create the coordination mechanisms in Ukraine, regardless of the fact that I cannot say that the sanction policy of Ukraine is exemplary. There are still many challenges, there are still issues, but the idea of how Ukraine builds its policy is very cool, because I think there is a two-level mechanism, intergovernmental working group and the expert team consisting of the representatives of different bodies like Central Intelligence Department, Ministry of Justice, Agency of Anti-Corruption, and other bodies, and the apparatus of Parliament. And there is another team consisting of first deputies or the first top-level government officials, and it gives us an opportunity to gather at the big round table, because first we were exchanging the notes and now we gather at this table. It's way more easier to work on imposition of the sanctions and to identify the ways to avoid the sanctions. So this instrument is quite cool in terms of its design, and now we have to work on its efficiency and to have its result implemented in a proper way, and not just to have them disappear for a long time. But here I would like to mention not only the avoidance of sanctions, but I will go a little bit ahead. I think that it's not only that the Ukrainian government lacks the liability for avoidance, not only that there are we need bodies to investigate this avoidance. So which will be the government body who investigates this avoidance of sanctions, who may investigate, interrogate, or make searches? Because nobody, because this is the avoidance is not criminalized, and there is no body who would be responsible for all this sanction process. And we have more problems with regard to individual sanctions. Why are they imposed? To change the attitude of an individual, to change their behavior. When we impose some sanctions against some Russian businessman, official, or oligarch, there is a question: what do we want that oligarch or official to do? How do we want their behavior to change? And there should be not only procedure of being added to the sanction list, but also removed from there, because if we don't give a clear signal, I'm talking about the individuals' sanctions, for example, if we don't let them know what do we want from them, we will not achieve our result if we don't communicate our demand to them. And it's important for us, no matter how difficult this discussion may be for Ukrainian society, but we have to dare to initiate this discussion too. We have to understand that we have to build this way. So I would like to say that talking about the Ukrainian sanction policy, what's lacking is organization of a clearer process of a body responsible for such sanctions and the criminalization of avoidance of sanction, and we catastrophically missed the procedure of being removed from the sanction list. Mr. Tom, are you with us?
Пане Томе,
Mr. Tom, so what do your studies say? Do you agree with the evaluation provided by our speakers just now?
Well, I think when you're, first of all, it's an honor to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. I think a lot of discussion that I've heard has centered around the idea of purpose and of goals, and what is the purpose of the sanctions program, both from the perspective of Ukraine and the West. And I think one of the things that has really been important over the last year and was really demonstrated at the war's anniversary with the announcement of the 10th package of sanctions is a new unity of purpose among the actors, especially in the West, on what sanctions are meant to achieve. If you think back a year ago, there was a lot of conversation among Western policymakers about sanctions being there to punish Russian aggression, or sanctions being there to instill regime change even, or sanctions being there to fracture Russian elites. And I think that those are all things that might be reasonable objectives. But the sanctions package announced on the 24th, and many of the speeches by, for instance, Deputy Secretary Agiya, as well as Janet Yellen, who was just in Kyiv, point to a very clear goal, which is degrading Russia's ability to continue the war. That is going after its finances and going after its import of critical materials. It's important to have that unity of purpose and that one central goal, because having that goal is necessary to optimize the sanctions regime to actually achieve that end. So I view that as a pretty significant step to actually formulate that goal in as crisp of words as we did. Now look at the effects of sanctions towards that goal. What have we seen so far in the year? It's been a mixed package. One of the speakers pointed out that the Russian economy has not contracted as much as people expected. The ruble is stronger now than it has been for a long time. Many economic effects have not yet come to bear on Russia's ability to finance and prosecute its war. But we are starting to see many effects of economic fatigue set in Russia. I read a statistic today that the number of cars produced in Russia today is lower than at any point since the Brezhnev regime. That, of course, includes the whole Soviet Union. The number of aircraft produced has gone down to record lows. There are reports that Russia is no longer able to do things like issue biometric passports because it lacks the ability to import chips for that purpose. Of course, we're seeing Russia prioritize sensitive component imports for its military machine, and so it still obviously has the ability to produce a lot of those critical systems through sanctions evasion networks. But the goal of sanctions, again, being to degrade Russia's ability to import those components and to go after its finances, will take some time to tell. But it is increasing every day Russia's cost to acquire those components. It's making it harder and harder for it to get those sensitive microelectronics that it needs for the high precision targeting of those systems. Going back to some of the policy announcements that we just saw come out of the 10th sanctions package from the US, the UK, the EU, we are seeing a clear focus on enforcement of existing sanctions. And there were a couple things that I noticed in a lot of those announcements that I think are going to be very significant going into 2023 as we look to the next year of sanctions enforcement. So some of those things include a clear focus, the speaker just now mentioned this, on big data technologies and technological advancements to detecting sanctions evasion. This is an issue that has obviously been something that OFAC and BIS have looked to for a long time, is how they're employing the best technology to detect sanctions evasion and better target sanctions. So I think you'll see some efforts in the US to significantly increase capabilities both at the Department of Commerce and the Departments of Treasury to enforce sanctions laws, which will be very, very good. You're seeing a clear and renewed focus on multilateralism in the sanctions announcements. You are seeing announcements on the importance of enforcement from Germany, from France, from the US, from the UK. In many ways, Germany with the strongest announcement from Vice Chancellor Habeck on the need to go after sanctions evaders, which is a very positive sign. You're seeing a focus on information sharing and intelligence sharing, which the speaker again just now pointed out, as a key factor of a multilateral sanctions regime. So sharing between US actors, European actors, private sector actors as well, who need this information to adequately enforce sanctions, is strong but can be strengthened. And I think that's a clear focus of the administration in the US as well as in the EU. And finally, one of the things that was very clearly foreshadowed in Secretary Agiya's remarks is an increasing use of secondary sanctions tools. Now, this will be the most important way, I think, for US sanctions especially to start to hit actors outside of the core sanctions coalition. As the speakers have all talked about, sanctions evasion is able to take place through countries in places like Central Asia, East Asia, as well as Eastern Europe. For those countries that don't get involved in the original sanctions coalition, the option to deploy secondary sanctions against companies that are actually directly facilitating sanctions evasion is an important tool that the US has deployed a lot in the Iran context, not as much in the Russia context so far. And so that, I think, will be a pretty significant change in the future. So looking forward to 2023, I think that some of the things that are going to be significant include that adoption of technology, include those secondary sanctions, and a continuing focus on degrading Russia's war capability as the central aim of the sanctions program. And just to go back to that last point, I think recognition of the long-term nature of degrading Russia's capability is a very significant change for how policymakers in the West have broadly thought about sanctions and about the conflict. And to me, it reflects a recognition that this is going to be a long-term conflict. This is not going to be something that we're able to crash the Russian economy in a matter of weeks. And that, I think, reflects a renewed commitment from Western leaders to the conflict and to the fight.
Дякую, Томе, за ваш коментар. Роман.
Thank you, Mr. Tom, for your commentary. Mr. Roman, we understand that everybody agrees that sanctions are actual, that it's a long-term instrument, but it still works. So let's try to summarize pluses and minuses. I would like to mention something different. I'm a secretary for something. Otherwise, Tom said that their automobiles are different because they don't have ABS, and in Russia they think that it's a problem that they don't have strings with their T packages. But what I see, the Russian narratives will be moving otherwise. From what I see from Russian analysts, from good Russians, they say that the sanctions start working against simple people, and what expects simple people, they say don't turn Russia into North Korea because it will become even more dangerous, and something that was difficult for us. We have to withdraw from something Ukrainian. It's clear that Russians work. It's clear that they're against. So it's quite cynic. We have to proceed to very cynical discussion. 68% of Europeans, they understand that the war going on now is an attack on Europe. So we have to say that sanctions are not only the protection of of Ukraine, but it's the protection of Europe. We know that Europeans made $1 billion on the logistics of the fuel. So the sanctions are a way to make money. We can say that it's bad to work with Russia, but we have to also mention that the big businesses, they remain in Russia for some sense. So I have a question to other participants of the discussion. Can we offer to Europeans this year? It will be a homework for Europeans. We have not to ask them to defend us, but we have to communicate some clear things to them. There is something that we can begin with. There is an example that we may start with to be safer together. It's clear that very important is the weapons market, because what Russians call the weapon, it's a cheap crap that can be destroyed in a cheap ways for Russians. Or can we change this paradigm and say, let's work together? Yaroslav, please. Well, I will start right away. There is an example of energy. For example, the Russian gas is being replaced with the cheaper analogs, but the level of security, the level of policy, and the level of media in such countries as Bulgaria, it grows times. So really it's worth developing, it's worth communicating, because it will be difficult to talk for us because we have certain nuances in this sphere. We all jumped off the Russian gas needle. If you do things right, the universe helps you. I cannot remember, for example, winter this warm, and all the attacks against infrastructure, they were directed at freezing Ukraine and Europe too. And yes, it's under communicated, and what we're saying, well, saying we mean ourselves and European Union, but just like Jerzy Hedrovets said, in order to become European, you have to become European. So us with Europe imposing sanctions, what we can get. I'm not an economist, but I think that the Economic Security Council may help us with that. Why do we talk more to the civil sector? Not because the government is incapable, they have a number of functions, and now we have to offer the solutions not only for ourselves, but what Agiya mentioned, the level of sanction policy that we have now is unprecedented, not only for us but for the whole world, and the system of coordination which is being created now for this network, in the end it should become it should grow to the institution level. And I think that there should be more directions like that. Russia can be avoided as a mediator in many economic chains. The fact that our country, due to the war, had to rethink its communication with the regions not only of Asia but also of Africa, and the number of opened representative offices and a number of visits to Africa is unprecedented for all the time of independence. Well, the cynical phrase that war and crisis is the time of opportunities, it's real. I see this in energy sector, we can see it in other critical spheres, and supporting what Roman said, right now we see the way, for example, how the opposition of Belarus communicates. They say that the sanctions should be personalized, not to be adopted against the people. It's manipulative, but it's efficient, because how can we not sell medicines to Russia? Is the impact on human rights, but the people should be always responsible for their actions. If the people do not protest, again referring to a very cool thought of Agiya, that we should initiate the discourse about what we think about the individuals on the sanction list, for their inclusion from such list, because such procedure is already in place. I mean, adding them to the list. This is how we just protect ourselves from the errors, and this moment is very important to think through, to analyze where is this limit between blaming of sanctions that they somehow affect the good Russians until the very moment that they become good, and how it covers the avoidance of sanctions. And it's a number of important matters. I apologize, I have to run a little bit earlier. I cannot say that the parliament does a great job in sanction policies. Unfortunately, this is the sphere of discussion in quite sensitive moments like sanctions. But really in May, our approaches which were proposed for imposition of sanction policy, they were adopted by the constitutional majority. It's about the quality of the issue, but as a homework we have to think about the mechanism of sanctions, how to withdraw from them in a more active manner. It will be the indicator that Russian oligarchs, Russian economy will start pondering over the matter what's after Putin, what's after the war, because such discourse does not exist anymore so far. And I'm asking the Economic Security Council, we need a paper to show that Europe doesn't lose from sanctions. Well, the energy sector is something obvious, but there are way more spheres like that. Thank you very much for this discussion. I will need to listen to the rest of it in the record. Yaroslav, on behalf of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, what are going to be your opportunities? Because it's first of all about the opportunities. Really, it's about the opportunities first of all, and us as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we started this discussion first during a personal context. During the close discussions, we hear the voices of European countries which think that they carry some burden for being part of the sanction coalition. Good examples are Greece and Turkey. Greece says, like, we're looking behind the corners. We see the Russian oligarchs, Russian yachts feel themselves quite well here in Greece, in European Union. But in Greece, our sea logistics is the key element of economy, and we have to carry this burden. And when we understand this narrative about punishment, the burden, we started with the help of the experts to say that it's not a punishment, it's the deterrent element, it's the only accessible systemic way to really make Russia incapable of carrying on the war. And like Tom mentioned, is the only purpose of ours to deter Russian potential to continue armed aggression against Ukraine, is the increase of technological gap. They are incapable of producing the high precision missiles now. We work on deterring their possibility to get connected to the system of GLONASS. We use the tactics of 1,000 cuts. We deter the operation of the banks. All the sanction packages which were announced on the 24th of February, we will hear the first signs of it with time. Britain already mentioned it, United States already mentioned it, Europe is still dependent on it. There are 18 nuclear reactors in Europe, but we provide evidences that Rosatom is being used as the source for supply of technological components for the rockets and missiles, and this is the confirmation that Agiya says about. Those are the evidences that Agiya mentioned about the sharing of information. We have to have the evidence base for imposition of the sanctions, because when the sanctions are going to be disputed, and this process is already on, so that this case stands in the course in favor, because for the states that, for the countries that impose sanctions, now the level of contacts with the countries like Global South, Latin America, Africa, it's quite different from what it used to be. There is a big number of visits, back channel contacts, where we receive signals that yes, we are ready to consider what other opportunities, because for energy sector, for example, Japan and Sakhalin-1 project, Sakhalin-2, Japan cannot just leave and close the tap. And now there is a situation when we have national economy, political situation in every country, and we have to adapt to it. Well, I want to ask for a couple of details. Is it the same Sakhalin which was taken where the international corporation Shell was deprived of all of its assets? Yes, exactly. And now with the countries of G7, we try to develop the mechanism, the transition mechanism for Japan, so it can start refusing gradually this Sakhalin oil. And this is what we do for the third countries in the sphere of nuclear technologies. Because like one representative of Session Coalition, I think from Lithuania, mentioned, she said we cannot shut down all the economic projects with Russia, but we may not start new ones. And those are the narratives that we should add to the conversations with our vis-a-vis. Not to start is an option too. It's the sanction too. And we try to build different economic proposals to close all that history, and it's a real opportunity. Look how Norwegian economy changed, how the GDP of Norway started growing after Europe started refusing the Russian gas, how LNG gas terminals logistics changed. The logistics changed and became more diversified, and it became cheaper. So there are a lot of opportunities. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I have to go to Miss Ilona. 10th sanction package, we see that it was agreed in a very, very difficult way. So what's further? What are the next steps? A little bit about your vision of our homework. Well, it's worth mentioning that any sanction package has been agreed upon in a very long, and Russian propaganda wanted to pay their attention that on the anniversary of the aggression, it was taken a lot of time, that the European Union is a big bureaucratic machine and they don't make it anything quickly. But we already picked that way of Euro integration for ourselves, and we have to agree with it. And in a couple of years, we will become a part of this institutional mechanism. Roman asked a very good question, where European Union can see benefits for themselves, advantages for themselves. But another question is where European businesses may see liabilities and responsibility. For example, here we are in the venue where we have photo shoots that corroborate the aggression of Russian Federation, and the businesses which infringe the sanctions and continue working with Russia, they are part of this crime, and it's very easy to prove from the abstract point of view, because there are articles of the Roman statute that say that the businesses that continue to provide Russia with instruments of continuing war with Ukraine, it helps in committing those crimes. And the main question is the purpose of such help. And within the first month of such full-scale invasion, it was actual, but when it's on for 1 year, such invasion, all the international businesses may see the consequences of this aggression, and if they keep helping Russian Federation, we cannot say that they do it without understanding what they do. And this Council of Economic Security of Ukraine, we made this study to see that Russian aggression is multidimensional, because all the missile strikes are combined with these cyber attacks and information attacks, and this hybrid aggression is not only against Ukraine but also against other countries like countries of European Union. And we may conclude that companies and businesses who continue helping Russian Federation, including and first of all helping with some difficult technical spheres, or not helping us to block any access of Russia to the high technology sectors of economy, those companies contribute to the attacks on their, or those businesses contribute to the attacks on their countries. And to protect themselves, those countries, we have to work against such businesses, because any authoritarian regimes with the hybrid attacks, they will try to commit aggressive actions against democratic world, and if democratic world will not respond in an efficient way, there will be nothing good. And talking about the homework, the main idea is coordination and cooperation. And here, being the representative of civil sector, not of a government body, I may express myself in a more brave manner. We need to have an authority, a body in Ukraine, which would be supported by legislation that may be responsible for sanction policy inside Ukraine, because we see examples when Russian businesses continue to work even in Ukraine. Fortunately, we try to fight with it, but those facts still exist, and it may demotivate some international partners from helping us or to reinforce the sanctions. And when we create such sanctioned body, we would be able to call to the creation of some sanctioned body in the international level, because we understand that the attitude to the sanctions should change. Many countries think that it's a political decision whether to impose sanctions or not, to be neutral or not, but it's the responsibility of any civilized state in compliance with the Statute of the United Nations to fight the violation of the main norms of international law. It should be a international body working based on the international conventions, and to track the effect of the sanction instruments on the global level. And EU is the platform to test such institutional structure, but we would like this system to have more global nature in future. And as to the cancellation of sanctions, it's very important too. I think that we should have mechanisms in place to stop sanctions when we talk about personal responsibility. And as to the Roman's question, how it will be used further on, even with propaganda, we have to divide individual sanctions and sectoral sanctions. And it's not about collective responsibility of Russians as the people, but as Russia as the state. So all the sectoral sanctions, they will exist until the very moment that the aggression ceases. And this individual sanctions should be more flexible, because they are aimed at changing of behavior of certain individuals. So it's, as Alexandra mentioned, it's good not to initiate any new projects. It should be a long-term strategy which should be declared, and it should not stop even as the war stops, because it should be a very good lesson for us, for European Union, for the United States, that dependency of business, dependency on the authoritarian regimes is transformed into a weapon against yourself eventually. So I would like to get some questions from the floor. Ivan Kozakin, Ukrinform, good afternoon. My question is, well, I would like to be skeptic here, however, I'm not a skeptic. In reality, Russia lives like in that joke. So when vodka becomes more expensive, the children ask, Daddy, are you going to drink less? No, dear son, you will eat less. So there are problems existing in Russia, but they just close their eyes to those policies. It's not going to be a strategic blow to the Russia, but do you see any moment when Russian economic machine would collapse? So who's your question addressed to? I'm not limiting anybody in their response. I would like to say that we focus our attention on Russia's capability to continue the war, and this capability consists on their ability to manufacture weapons, to repair weapons, and to manufacture such elementary details as helmets, as the glass for windows of their military material, and its capability of Russian state to maintain this war from the point of view of availability of funds, to have the economy move on, and talking about the capability of Russia to manufacture, to repair material, and to procure the spare parts. We see significant results, and we see the possibility to achieve better results. And regardless of the fact that Russia keeps procuring semiconductors, electronic components, and the rest that they need to maintain their material operating, they procure it in a longer ways at more expensive price, because they have to pay additional money making way around sanctions, and the quality of those components is disputable because they don't have original components, and they procure it in the gray or black market, and they may not procure something they really need. And we're talking about the period within the last couple of months, the sanction coalition was taking measures to cut those ways for supplying of those components, the software for their machines. And I see that within the next year we will be able to achieve the results when Russia will be left with only the components mostly, or I think that exclusively, manufactured by the countries which do not join the sanction list, and they manufacture it by themselves. I'm talking about the People's Republic of China and its partners like Iran and so on. And we may cut Russia completely from Western software, Western components and Western equipment. And the Economic Security Council of Ukraine takes significant part in this work, and if we will be able to reach the machinery, because Russia uses mostly foreign-made machines for manufacturing of their weapons, it's Taiwan, United States, European Union. If they will not be able to procure new machines, you cannot create a drone out of sticks and crap, but well, you cannot do it without the proper machinery, without proper manufacturing equipment. Talking about Russian economy and Russian society, I take it quite skeptically. The Russian person to feel sorrow, their ability is huge in this regard, and I'm not sure we will come to the point when the patience of Russian people will collapse, and we don't have to rely on that. And in terms of pressure on Russian economy, in terms of trying to communicate this information to the Russians, that there is life you used to have, there are lives you used to have, and that there is a new life you're having now, and you may get back to your previous lives, normal lives. So we have to talk about that as the secondary measures. But we have to make sure that Russian war machine doesn't have something that they used to have before. Tom, getting back to our homework, what's your opinion in this regard? What do you think? What should we do? What should our government bodies do or civil sector do to make it happen, to reinforce the sanction pressure?
Echo what was just said, which is the framing of causing a Russian economic collapse is, I think, not helpful. Iran's economy has been under more significant sanctions pressure for a much longer time, and it hasn't collapsed. It's gone under stress. It's made it more difficult for Iran to pursue high technology systems. But a collapse, either economic or moral, is, I think, not the objective of sanctions policy. I think sanctions policy has to accompany all of the other things that are going on, diplomatic pressure, of course, the heroic military campaign being waged by Ukraine itself, supplies to Ukraine. All these things are part of the same picture. And imagine for yourself a world in which we're doing all those other things, but we have no sanctions. That doesn't make any sense. So sanctions are a part of the solution, but they're not going to be a magic bullet. And I think that's important to keep in mind. Specifically with what we can do and what in particular civil society can do, I think that Ukraine has been extremely innovative and forward-leaning in identifying instances of sanctions evasion and sharing that information with the world, both publicly and privately. The Economic Security Council of Ukraine in particular has produced excellent work that I have seen both publicly and privately, directed toward identifying sanctions evasion networks with precision and with the level of granularity needed to support action from partners. I think that type of activity, that type of coordinated information sharing on a very tactical level is important for civil society organizations to play a role in supporting formal sanctions machinery. I think that there is a role for civil society to play in informing banks directly to voluntarily shut off their own services to people who may not be formally sanctioned, but who are nevertheless supporters of sanctioned individuals. And I'm sure everyone here can think of a couple examples who might fit that sort of description. So would love to turn the floor back over to other speakers to address these and other issues, but I think that information sharing and transnational cooperation by civil society is an essential part of the sanctions enforcement priority going into 2023.
Романе, чи погоджуєтесь ви з тими домашніми завданнями?
Roman, do you agree with this information that was voiced by our speakers and the perspectives that Ms. Ilona and Ms. Agiya mentioned as to the increase of such pressure and reinforcement of sanction policy? On one hand, I do agree. On the other hand, Yaroslav is absent here. He was wearing a sweater which confirms his fight with corruption, because energy sector is a good example of how we can make money together with, they can make money with Ukraine, but we don't have to transform Ukraine into Russia because it's a dangerous weapon. The question is not, we may show how we work efficiently, but we may show how we do not embezzle stuff. And we may look several years ahead and to prove to the businesses that it's better not to work with the slavers rather than to work with them, or not to work with coal mining and coal burning. And in the same way, they should feel unpleasant working with Russia. It should become toxic, but we have to be very different from Russian Federation internally. So my question is to Agiya, so how are we capable of doing it? Because Corruption Prevention Agency is the agency of prevention, not fighting the corruption. Well, I think everything is possible. Ukrainian people proved it starting from the 24th of February, but within a couple of hundreds of years of our history, we proved it, it's possible. And maybe I will say something unpopular, and maybe somebody will throw a rock at me, but everything starts with us. From every single one of us, we may be talking about different government agencies, abbreviations that somebody may be irritated about. Well, Nabu, Sap, Vesu, but everything starts with us personally. And within the last couple of years, we were convinced that the demand of the society is being implemented in practice. For example, we demand more sanctions. There are more sanctions. We demand the sanctions which would be more efficient, which would be difficult to avoid. We impose such sanctions, and if we want less corruption, and in not that understanding that, as there is a saying that I want less corruption, but I want my brother in Christ to be able to sort out everything for me. So I want this to disappear from inside. I've seen a lot of people who came after Maidan to all those government agencies, and those people never worked with the government, and they continued their doing their job. But some of the people, and lion's share of those people, they started sharing those sanctions like it's more comfortable to go with the flow, to understand that there is the state position, there is a state interest, and if it will be a joint demand, we will overcome corruption. It's quite achievable thing, and it will not take decades, but we have this window of opportunities. So that amount of blood, that the best Ukrainian blood that Ukraine lost, is the motivation, is a stimulus that should move all of us forward, because it's not only about the victory. Victory is imminent, no one has any doubt about this, but it's about what's going to happen after the victory. Ukraine is the symbol of international policy. It's the lighthouse of international democracy. Ukraine in the world arena is the most powerful voice that may only sound. And what can we as a Ukrainian nation do with what we got through all this blood which was shed through our sacrifice? That's the main matter. We may become one of the leaders of European Union. We may become one of the leadership voices of the world. We have this opportunity to become an example. We have a lot of opportunities. So it's not about energy sector only. Let's talk about the rare metals, about titan and the rare metals market of Russia goes out of the world market, and the same with the Chinese rare metals market. It was integrated into global economy a year ago, way more than they are now. Ukraine may build a lot for processing industry. Ukraine initiated a discussion in the world arena, so let's disclose your reserves of the food. And many countries refuse to do it, and Ukraine may become a country that feeds, not only feeds the world, but feeds it in a new way. And all those initiatives, grain from Ukraine, so that every housewife in the, say, in the Middle East takes this bottle of oil and they see the Ukrainian flag on it. So what country ever brought up this discussion on the state level? Like 4 years ago, FBI was investigating a case against Rothenberg about, and a woman who never existed was procuring works of art in Sotheby's auctions, and we understand how many things are happening in the art market and the jewelry market, and Ukraine says, like, let's build a new track system on the diamond market, and we can offer a new more ideas. And those sanctions, they brought a lot of tangible and intangible effects, and many countries, they silently support the actions. And we may not only overcome the corruption, but to become a leader who may be able to rebuild this new post-war world after this turbulent decade we had. Dear colleagues, if you have any questions or comments, please go ahead, because our time is almost over. So if not, I will offer the last remark for us speakers. Well, in summary, I would like to mention again that the sanctions cannot stop the war, but they can make it shorter. And I'm sure that for this we try to do the sanction policy more effective. And it's not a question that the democratic world takes over, but it's the matter of time, and we have to do everything we can to make the number, to reduce the number of sufferings for Ukrainian people. So yes, I don't like when people say that when this war is over we have to prepare for a new war. But in reality, we have to make sure that another war does not happen, neither aggressive war against Ukraine nor any war in any part of the world. So we have to build this sanction policy with regard to the preventive sanctions too. It was not done before, but we have to do something to make sure this situation never repeats. So we have to build this cooperation between our international partners, civil society and government sector. Thank you. If anybody has any commentary, please go ahead. I would like to dispute a little bit more. I'm from a Western country, and I remember that this war used to be 10,000 kilometers more to the west, and I think in 100 years it will move like 10,000 kilometers to the east. So this is what I mean. Tom, do you have any final comment?
I think all the other speakers have said it better than I can. I think that sanctions are going to continue to be a baseline function that we need to maintain for success in this conflict. I think that you have seen a lot more unity in the sanctions coalition than we expected at the beginning of the war, and I think that's going to endure, especially as we enter the next year. So I think all the other speakers have said all the points I could say much better than I could.
Я дякую вам, шановні колеги, за цікавість до цієї.
Dear colleagues, thank you for the interest to this topic. I want to thank our speakers for their professional opinions, and we continue supporting our armed forces and working together for our victory. Glory to Ukraine.
Перевіримо всі.